No one handed you a rule book. No speech explained how to behave. No one discussed who you might become. Yet, if you grew up in 1970s Britain, you understood the limits with remarkable precision. You learned by observing which child was praised, which one was corrected, which one was quietly set apart. Nothing was announced. Everything was assessed. Attention was not freedom, it was exposure. Achievement had to be understated, opinions moderated, emotion restrained. So you adjusted, not from obedience, from instinct. Safety mattered more than scrutiny. Here is what few admit. It never felt enforced. It felt proper, orderly, right, but rules that feel inevitable rarely invite resistance. They shape you long before you notice the shaping. Standing out carried a cost. Not dramatic, not immediate, but real. In a 1970s British classroom, her brilliance was welcome. Display was not. If you answered too eagerly, you were showing off. If you spoke too loudly, you were a bit much. If you dressed too boldly, you were asking for it. The correction rarely came as anger. It came as tone, a raised eyebrow, a pause before your name, laughter that lingered half a second too long. You learned the calibration, how much enthusiasm was acceptable, how much confidence was tolerable, how visible you were allowed to be. Ambition survived, but it had to be disguised. Success was safest when it appeared accidental. Effort was admirable, as long as it remained invisible. And so a generation mastered a quiet skill. How to excel without appearing exceptional. Tell me, what happens to a child who learns to dim the light before it shines too brightly? Silence did not mean peace. It meant reading the room. In many 1970s British homes, feelings were treated like private property. You could have them. You just could not leave them lying around. Adults rarely asked what was wrong. They watched. A teacup set down too firmly. A sigh that arrived a fraction early. A door closed with careful force. You learned that questions were risky. Ask too much, and you were making a fuss. Explain too much, and you were being dramatic. So you became fluent in signals. A glance meant stop. A pause meant apologize. A quiet right meant the conversation was over. And because no one named the emotion, you started naming yourself. Don't be silly. Don't be soft. Keep it together. Here is the psychological trick. When a child is trained to hide the feeling does not disappear. It simply moves inward. And later, as an adult, you call that self-control. Even when it is fear. You were expected to know your place. No one drew a map. But the boundaries were clear. In the classroom, the teacher's words settled the matter. In the queue, position was sacred. On the street, older meant authority. Hierarchy was not discussed. It was absorbed. You did not interrupt. You did not correct. You did not presume. Even humor had a limit. Laugh too loudly at the wrong moment, and the room cooled. Question too directly, and you were cheeky. The lesson was subtle. Respect flowed upward, restraint flowed downward. And once you understood the pattern, life became easier, predictable, stable. But here is the quiet cost. If you always know your place, you rarely test its edges. If you rarely test it, you begin to believe it is fixed. And a fixed place can start to feel like a fixed self. The streets felt free. After school, you disappeared for hours. No tracking, no constant check-ins, just bicycles, pavements, and time. You could wander further than your parents ever knew. But not infinitely. There was an invisible perimeter. You sensed it without measuring it. The corner shop marked one edge, the railway bridge another. The moment the streetlights flickered on was the final warning. No one needed to shout. You already knew. Freedom worked because it had limits. Cross them, and the air changed. A neighbor noticed. A curtain moved. A question waited at home. You were trusted, but it was a conditional trust, earned through predictability, maintained through return, and so you learned something powerful. Independence was permitted, as long as it remained contained. The world felt wide, but only inside the lines. By the time you reached adulthood, the rules no longer felt external. They felt like you. You called it composure. You called it resilience. You called it not making a scene. You could endure discomfort without naming it. You could swallow disappointment without display. You could carry worry without sharing it. From the outside, it looked like strength. And often, it was. You were steady in crisis, measured in argument, reliable under strain. But strength learned in silence has a shadow. If you are praised for coping, you keep coping. If you are admired for calm, you hide the storm. Somewhere along the way, restraint becomes identity. Not something you practice, something you are. And when emotion finally pushes back, it feels unfamiliar, almost improper, as though the rule you absorbed as a child is still watching, asking you to stay contained. So what did those unwritten rules create? Not a broken generation, not a perfect one either. They created adults who could function without fuss, who understood boundaries without negotiation, who rarely mistook noise for importance. There was dignity in that, a steadiness that did not need applause. Communities held together by mutual restraint, classrooms that ran on quiet authority, homes that valued order over confession. But every structure shapes what grows inside it. When expression is moderated, self-expression narrows. When emotion is contained, intimacy requires effort. When place is fixed, ambition learns to move carefully. The rules offered stability. They also defined the ceiling. And perhaps that is the paradox. You felt free. You felt proper. You felt prepared for the world, because the world had already prepared you to fit it. Perhaps that is why it is difficult to explain. When people look back, they remember safety. They remember structure. They remember knowing how things worked. And they are not wrong. There was comfort in predictability, in doors that closed at the same hour, in teachers who rarely doubted themselves, in neighbors who watched, even when you wished they wouldn't. But comfort and constraint often share a border. If everything has its place, you rarely question the arrangement. If everyone understands the limits, few test them, and so the rules endured, not because they were written, but because they felt reasonable. That is how cultures sustain themselves, quietly, through habits that appear natural, until a new generation asks a different question. And suddenly, what once felt inevitable becomes visible.